Hey there, guys, and welcome to one last video lecture for Psych 370. In my last few video lectures, I've talked mostly about theories of observational learning, but in this one, I'm going to focus on a more applied matter. In this video lecture, I'm going to be talking about the observations that we make through various forms of media and how those observed behaviors might affect us. Because after all, we live in an age where not every model that we observe is physically present with us in the same environment, right? We observe lots of models and their behavior on television screens, computer screens, smartphone screens. And in fact, one of Bandura's findings from his Bobo doll research was that children were just as likely to imitate the aggressive behavior of a filmed model as they were that of a live in-person model. So you hear a lot about how televised violence might affect the people who view it, right? Especially how it might affect the children who view it. But that's not a new issue in psychology. Researchers in observational learning have been interested for a long time in this question about whether viewing media violence causes an increase in aggressive behavior. And so that's the first issue that I'll be addressing in this lecture. Now, first of all, it's clear enough that there is a direct positive correlation between exposure to media violence and aggressive behavior. So, kids who see more violence on TV and in other forms of media do tend, on average, to exhibit more aggression. Those variables are correlated. But of course, there are limits to the conclusions that we can draw from correlational evidence like that. We certainly can't conclude, on the basis of that positive correlation, that more exposure to media violence causes more aggressive behavior because correlation doesn't imply causation, right? You've probably heard that before. Correlation does not imply causation. And it's true. Just because two variables are correlated with one another, that doesn't necessarily mean that changes in one of them actually cause changes in the other one. So there are many reasons why two variables might wind up being correlated with each other, and a cause and effect relationship is only one of those reasons. So, to better assess whether media violence actually causes aggressive behavior, we need to look at other types of research findings too. For example, one way to address this question is to conduct what's known as a longitudinal study, which is where you measure the variables that you're interested in at two or more points in time, but you measure them in the same people. So, if you were interested in this relationship between media violence and aggressive behavior, then what you might do is take a sample of people, measure how aggressive they are and how much media violence they watch once when they're at one age. So, you measure those variables once at time one, and then you come back later, maybe years later or even decades later, and you'd measure aggressive behavior and media violence viewing again in those same people at time two. So that's how you'd conduct a longitudinal study on this question. For example, in one longitudinal study like that, over 800 individuals had their aggressive behavior and their exposure to media violence measured once when they were 8, and then once again 11 years later when they were 19. The results of that study were that violence viewing at age 8 was correlated with aggressive behavior at age 19. So, for example, people who watched more violent TV when they were young went on to commit more crimes. That's what the graph is illustrating. But aggressive behavior at age 8 was not correlated with violence viewing at age 19. So, in other words, more aggressive behavior in adulthood did tend to follow from more exposure to media violence in childhood, but more exposure to media violence in adulthood did not tend to follow from more aggressive behavior in childhood. So, guys, the reason a finding like this is interesting and important is because it suggests that if there is a cause and effect relationship between media violence and aggressive behavior, then it would have to be that media violence is the cause and aggressive behavior is the effect. Because causes have to occur before their effects, right? That's just the way the world works. So these findings argue against the idea that aggressive behavior causes increased exposure to media violence. So, in other words, it doesn't seem to be the case that media violence and aggression are correlated simply because people who are naturally aggressive in the first place just seek out violent forms of media. That's a possibility that the correlational evidence does not allow us to rule out, but this longitudinal evidence does. And similar results have been reported more recently. For example, in one study, males who watched the most violence as 6 to 9 year olds were 15 years later twice as likely as the other males in the sample to report having pushed, grabbed, or shoved their significant others. So, more exposure to media violence in childhood was followed by more of those aggressive behaviors in adulthood. And furthermore, the females in the sample who watched the most violence as children were also twice as likely to report having thrown something at their romantic partners. So, we're seeing more of that tendency here for early media violence exposure to be associated with later aggressive behavior. And interestingly, guys, those links were especially strong among boys and girls who perceived the violence they saw as being more realistic, and among those who more closely identified with the characters who perpetrated the violence. So, that last factor, the identification with the person carrying out the violence, is especially noteworthy here because it could help explain this difference that we're seeing between males and females. So, in both groups, high TV violence viewing in childhood was associated with more aggression in adulthood, but that was especially true among the boys. And so, it's possible that boys might be especially susceptible to the effects of media violence, since most of the violent behavior that's depicted in the media is performed by male models, and boys are obviously more likely to identify with those violent male models than girls would be. So, longitudinal research like this is informative, and it does have certain advantages over simple correlational evidence. But having said that, longitudinal studies still can't conclusively tell us that there's a cause and effect relationship either between media violence and aggression, because they don't provide the same level of control of outside confounding variables as an experiment would. So, if we really want to know whether media violence causes aggressive behavior, then we need to look at experiments too. We need to look at studies that have manipulated exposure to media violence as an independent variable and then measured aggressive behavior as a dependent variable. Now, guys, I should mention here that there is some solid experimental evidence linking violent TV shows and violent movies to later aggressive behavior. There are experiments that have reported greater levels of aggression among people who were randomly assigned to watch violent shows than among people who were randomly assigned to watch nonviolent shows. So there is some evidence suggesting that just watching televised violence can cause increased aggression. But what I actually want to focus on for the next few minutes of this video lecture is some more recent research on the effects of video game violence, which we might expect to have even stronger effects on its audiences because with video games, the observer isn't just passively watching the violence, right? In most cases, the observers are active participants in the violence because they're actually the ones who are pressing the buttons and making the violence happen. And there is some evidence consistent with the idea that participating in violence, even in video game form, produces stronger effects than just passively watching it. For example, in one study, some fifth and sixth grade children actually played a violent video game while others just watched the action on the screen. And the results of that study were that, at least among the boys, the ones who played the game went on to exhibit more aggression later than the ones who just watched it. So as you can see in this graph, there's a pretty dramatic difference here between the active players and their aggression versus the passive viewers and their aggression. So that effect was found among the boys. Now, the failure of that study to find the same kind of effect among the girls is interesting. And the reason for that may involve the whole identification with the model factor that I just talked about a few minutes ago. Because after all, the violent games in this study included a James Bond game, a fighting game, and a military combat game, each of which featured predominantly male protagonists. And so that could explain, at least partly, why the female players and watchers didn't show significant differences in aggression like the males did. And so it would be interesting to see whether a violent game with a female protagonist, like, say, Tomb Raider, would have the same kind of effect with girls as the games in this study had with boys. So, anyway, there's some evidence to suggest that playing violent video games might have stronger effects on aggression than just watching them. And it also seems to be the case that just as we see regarding televised violence, more realistic video game violence also has more of an effect than less realistic game violence does. For example, in another study, people who played Doom 3 rated the violence they saw as being more realistic than people who played the original Doom did, which makes sense because those games came out 11 years apart from one another. And after each participant played their assigned game for 12 minutes, they completed a questionnaire. And the results of that questionnaire indicated that the ones who played the more realistic Doom 3 expressed more physically aggressive intentions than the ones who played the less realistic original game. So, for example, one of the items on the survey asked them about what they would do if someone bumped into them, spilling their drink and the contents of their backpack. And the ones who played Doom 3 were significantly more likely to say that they would hit or threaten that person compared to the ones who played the original Doom. Another study like that found that people who played a realistically violent military game went on to report more aggressive thoughts and more aggressive feelings than people who played a less realistic but still violent Star Wars game. But as you can see in this graph, both of those games were associated with more aggressive feelings than a non violent tennis game was. So, realism isn't the only factor in whether or not violence leads to aggression. Less realistic violence can still do that. But the evidence seems to suggest that the more realistic the violence is, the more likely it is that aggressive thoughts, aggressive feelings, and aggressive behaviors will result from playing it or watching it. And of course, given the fact that technology is always advancing and games are only getting more and more realistic as it does, results like these are important because they suggest that whatever effects violent video games have now and whatever effects they've had in the past in older research studies, we might expect those effects to become even stronger in the future. So, guys, if you take all of the evidence as a whole, if you look at the correlational evidence, the longitudinal evidence, the experimental evidence, the conclusion that all of that evidence seems to converge upon is that, yeah, media violence does seem to cause increases in aggression. That's a pretty well accepted consensus on this matter among psychologists. So, for example, this is a quote from a report by the American Academy of Pediatrics. They concluded that media violence can contribute to aggressive behavior and desensitization to violence. And as page 309 of your textbook describes, a panel of experts consisting of psychologists, psychiatrists, and pediatricians was recently put together to review the evidence on televised violence and aggressive behavior in children. And they reached a similar verdict. They concluded that there was, and I quote, overwhelming support in favor of a causal effect of media violence on aggression. So clearly, there are some negative, undesirable effects that mass media, like movies and video games, can have on the people who are exposed to it. However, I think it's also important to mention some of the beneficial effects that mass media can have. So I want to talk about some of that research next. First of all, while it certainly seems to be true that kids can learn to imitate the violence that they see on a screen, they seem to be able to learn more helpful, more pro social forms of behavior too. For example, in one study by Joyce Sprafkin and her colleagues, first grade children were randomly assigned to watch one of three TV show episodes before they were put in a situation that would allow them to exhibit helpful pro social behavior. Some of the kids saw an episode of the TV show Lassie, where a puppy falls into a mine shaft and someone risks their life to save the puppy. So the kids in that group got exposed to a model who demonstrated some clearly helpful, clearly pro social behavior, right? Other kids saw a different episode of Lassie that didn't feature any dramatic examples of helping like that. It was about Lassie's master trying to get out of having to take violin lessons. And the kids in a third group saw an episode of The Brady Bunch that didn't feature pro social behavior or a dog. It was about two of the Brady children trying to set a record for most time on a seesaw. So, all of the kids in this study watched a family friendly, age appropriate television show, but only the kids in that first group saw a pro social, helpful model. So, that was the independent variable in this experiment. Which episode did the kids watch? Later, the children were introduced to a game that they could play for points. So, to earn the points, they just had to press a blue button on a platform. And they were told that at the end of the study, they'd be able to exchange their points for a prize. And the more points they earned, the better the prize they could get. So there's one button in this room that the kids can press for points. But the experimenter also told these kids that she wanted them to listen through headphones for the sound of barking dogs at a nearby kennel. Because if the dogs were barking, then that meant they were in trouble and they needed some help. Now, the experimenter told each kid that normally she'd be the one to listen for the barking, but she wouldn't be able to do that while the kids were playing the game, so she wanted them to do it for her while she was out of the room. So she said to each kid, look, if you don't hear any barking, then the dogs are okay. They're either playing quietly or they're sleeping. But if you do hear them barking, then that means something is wrong. That means the dogs might be in some kind of trouble. And if you want, you can help the dogs by pressing this other button with the word help on it. And if you do press that button, then that'll signal my helper who lives near the kennel so that he can go and check on the dogs. Okay, so in addition to the points button, there was also a help button in this room. And importantly, those two buttons were far enough away from each other that the kids couldn't press both of them at the same time. So if the kid hears barking through their headphones, then they can't help the dogs and continue to earn points in the game. They have to choose. And the experimenter told the kids that it was up to them what they did. And she also told them that they might have to press the help button for a long time before the helper would hear the signal. She told them that the helper was more likely to hear the signal if they pressed the help button a lot, and that the only way that they would be able to tell whether the helper got their signal would be if the dogs stopped barking. Okay, so that's the setup for this study. Each kid watches whatever show they've been randomly assigned to watch. Then they get introduced to this points game. They also get told about the situation with the dogs at the kennel and how if the dogs start barking, they can help those dogs by pressing this help button. And once the kid understood everything, the experimenter would leave the room and the kid would start playing the points game with their headphones on. Now, for the first 30 seconds, each kid played in silence with no noises coming through the headphones. But then they heard 2 solid minutes of increasingly frantic barking by dogs. Now, what the kids were actually hearing was a tape recording, of course, but obviously the kids didn't know that. So, the dependent variable in this study was just how much time will each kid spend pressing the help button instead of the points button. So, they're in a situation now where they have to choose between selfish gain, more points, and pro social behavior, helping the dogs, right? So, what the researchers wanted to know was how much pro social behavior will these kids exhibit toward the dogs? And the results are illustrated in this graph. So, as you can see, the kids who saw the pro social model, the ones who saw someone risk their life to save a puppy, those kids pressed the help button for significantly more time than the kids who saw either the neutral Lassie episode about the violin lessons or the kids who saw the Brady Bunch episode about the seesaw record. Not only that, but 90% of the kids who saw the pro social episode of Lassie offered at least some help to these dogs, whereas only 70% of the kids who saw the other two programs offered any help. So, the important takeaway from this research and other studies like it is that kids don't just imitate the violent models that they see on television. They seem to imitate the nicer, more helpful, more pro social models that they see too. Now, a related point, as far as the positive effects of media are concerned, is that other research also suggests that certain child oriented shows, especially those that make a conscious effort to be educational, also seem to be beneficial for language development. So, for example, in one longitudinal study, 3 to 5 year old children who watched Sesame Street regularly were found to have better vocabulary scores 2 years later than kids who didn't watch the show. And in fact, those effects were still there even after the researchers factored out variables like parents' education levels, the size of the family, and the parents' attitudes toward television. So, those variables can affect language development, of course, but you can control for them statistically. And after the researchers did that, they still found that watching Sesame Street was associated with higher vocabulary scores. They also found that vocabulary at the younger ages did not predict the amount of Sesame Street that the kids watched at the older ages, which again is important because it suggests that it's Sesame Street leading to better vocabularies rather than the other way around. So it's not just that kids with better vocabularies in the first place are just more likely to watch Sesame Street. Again, that's a possibility that the longitudinal research is able to rule out. And so it's more likely that watching Sesame Street would be the cause and that the better vocabulary would be the effect. So Sesame Street has been identified as one program that seems to be able to foster better language development. And more recent research has found that newer programs appear to have beneficial effects too. So, for example, these researchers, Linebarger and Walker, got viewing logs from parents on their children's TV watching habits, starting when the kids were just 6 months old and continuing until they were 2.5. And after factoring out variables like parental education and family income level, they found that certain shows were related to increases in both receptive language and expressive language. So, in other words, there were a few shows that seemed to facilitate the kids' abilities to both comprehend language and to produce it themselves. For example, among the most beneficial programs that they identified were Blue's Clues and Dora the Explorer, which the researchers attributed to the fact that those shows have characters in them that speak directly to the viewers and that elicit active participation from the viewers by pausing to allow them to respond to questions. The researchers also found that shows like Clifford the Big Red Dog and Dragon Tales were good for language development too, possibly because those shows have a sort of storybook format and because they really emphasize the introduction and the definition of new vocabulary words. Now, not all of the shows that the researchers looked at had beneficial effects. For example, watching the show Teletubbies was actually negatively correlated with language development. The show Barney and Friends was also negatively correlated with vocabulary acquisition. And the researchers actually found no correlation at all between watching Disney movies and the kids' language abilities. So, family friendly, kid themed programming doesn't seem to automatically foster better language skills, but researchers have identified a few variables, like the storybook format and speaking directly to the viewer, that seem to make a show more likely to benefit the kids who watch it. So, the moral of the story here, I guess, is that the news isn't all bad when it comes to the effects of television and other forms of media. It can certainly have negative, undesirable effects, like the stuff I talked about regarding aggression, but parents can minimize the bad and maximize the good by keeping an eye on what their kids watch and, if need be, exerting a little more control over the types of media that they allow their kids to get exposed to. So, pretty simple, pretty intuitive parenting advice there, I suppose, but it's advice that does have sound evidence behind it. Okay, well, that's going to just about do it for this final video lecture of the semester. As always, if you have questions about anything, then please do let me know. And I'll sign off here by just saying that I've enjoyed teaching this course. I hope you've enjoyed taking it. And I sincerely wish you guys all the best in the future and everything that you do. Take care.